People will always judge what shines before they ask what it survived. The first thing most guests noticed about me wasn't the polished silver tray balanced on my hand or the perfectly pressed black uniform that had taken 20 minutes to iron before dawn. It was the ring. A thin silver band with a small oval sapphire worn smooth by decades of loving hands, resting quietly on my left ring finger like it had every single day since my grandmother slipped it into my palm on her deathbed. The ballroom of the Hawthorne Grand Hotel glittered beneath crystal chandeliers that looked like frozen waterfalls, reflecting warm light across marble floors polished so perfectly they mirrored every expensive shoe that crossed them. Charity galas always smelled the same. Fresh roses. Imported perfume. A hint of aged whiskey. Money had its own scent, and after 3 years working as a maid, I had learned to recognize it before anyone spoke. I kept my eyes lowered as I adjusted the linen napkins around a table reserved for executives whose watches probably cost more than my entire apartment building. Staying invisible was part of the job. Invisible people kept their jobs. Invisible people paid rent. Invisible people avoided becoming stories whispered by management the next morning. "Excuse me," a woman's voice called sharply from behind me. Did anyone actually look at her hand? I froze before slowly turning around with my practiced smile still carefully in place. 3 elegantly dressed women sat near the center of the ballroom, each wearing enough diamonds to scatter tiny rainbows across their wine glasses. One of them pointed directly at my ring while another covered her laugh behind a champagne flute. "That's adorable," the first woman said. "She actually wears it to work." A man beside them leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tailored jacket before grinning. "Maybe it's plastic. Vintage costume jewelry is making a comeback." Their table erupted with polite laughter. Not cruel enough to cause a scene. Just sharp enough to remind someone exactly where they belonged. I felt my cheeks grow warm, but my fingers never moved toward the ring. They never would. "Ma'am," I said softly, "may I refill your water?" "Actually," she replied, tilting her head as if studying an exhibit in a museum, "you should probably take that ring off. It doesn't exactly match the image this hotel is trying to sell." More laughter followed, blending effortlessly into the soft melody drifting from the string quartet across the ballroom. I lowered my gaze again. "I'm sorry if it's distracting." "Distracting?" another guest chuckled. "Honey, we're trying to help you." I nodded because arguing with wealthy strangers had never once improved anyone's life. My grandmother used to tell me that dignity wasn't something other people could hand you or take away. It only disappeared the moment you traded it for anger. So I simply adjusted the water pitcher in my hands and quietly continued serving the table. But before I could take my next step, the laughter stopped. Not faded. Stopped. The kind of silence that sweeps through a crowded room when someone important walks inside. I didn't look immediately. Employees weren't supposed to stare at VIP arrivals. Instead, I noticed something else. Every security guard near the entrance straightened at exactly the same moment. Conversations softened into respectful whispers. Even the hotel manager hurried toward the lobby with a nervous smile I had never seen before. Curious despite myself, I lifted my eyes just enough to catch the reflection in one of the ballroom mirrors. A tall man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit had entered beneath the chandeliers. His dark hair was neatly combed back, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. He acknowledged no one. Not the executives waiting to greet him. Not the photographers gathering near the entrance. His attention moved slowly across the ballroom until it stopped on one person. Me. More precisely, on the worn silver ring resting quietly against my hand. And unlike everyone else in that magnificent room, he didn't smile. I could not explain why that stranger's expression unsettled me more than the laughter ever had. Most powerful men arrived expecting attention. They smiled for cameras, shook hands with donors, and accepted compliments as naturally as breathing. This man did none of those things. He stood perfectly still beneath the chandelier, studying the room with quiet patience before his eyes returned to my hand. Not to my face. Not to my uniform. To the old silver ring that everyone else had dismissed. I looked away first. Employees were trained not to stare at guests, especially guests important enough to make the hotel manager nearly run across the ballroom. "Grace," my supervisor whispered urgently as she appeared beside me. "Bring fresh sparkling water to the Moretti table. Be careful." Her voice carried a nervous edge I had never heard before. "Who is he?" I asked quietly while reaching for another polished bottle. She hesitated for half a second. "Just do your job." That answer told me more than any introduction could have. Important people rarely needed explanations. Their names explained themselves. I balanced the tray carefully and walked toward the private table that overlooked the city skyline through 30-foot windows. Outside, Manhattan shimmered beneath thousands of lights, each building glowing against the dark spring sky. Inside, the music resumed as though the silence had never happened, yet I could still feel curious eyes following me after the awkward exchange from only minutes earlier. I reminded myself to breathe slowly. One careful step after another. Do not spill. Do not trip. Do not become another story people laugh about over dessert. When I reached the table, the man was speaking quietly with two older businessmen. His voice remained calm, almost gentle, but both men listened without interrupting. Whatever authority he possessed did not need to be announced. It simply existed. I began pouring sparkling water into the crystal glass nearest him. My hand stayed steady until he spoke. "Thank you." Two ordinary words. Polite. Respectful. The kind of words guests almost never said to housekeeping staff. I looked up instinctively. His eyes were a deep gray, steady and thoughtful rather than intimidating. Up close, he seemed younger than I had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with the composed confidence of someone who had learned long ago that raising his voice accomplished very little. "You are welcome, sir," I answered. As I moved toward the second glass, one of the businessmen glanced at my hand and smiled with obvious amusement. "Interesting jewelry choice," he said. "It has certainly become the conversation of the evening." Heat rose into my face again, but before I could answer, the man beside him laughed softly. Perhaps the hotel should include imitation antiques as part of the uniform. They expected him to join them. Instead, the silence that followed stretched several long seconds. The man slowly set his glass onto the white linen tablecloth without taking his eyes off the ring. "May I ask you something?" he said. His tone remained calm, directed only at me. "Of course, sir." "How long have you worn that ring?" The question caught me completely off guard. "Since I was 16, I replied honestly. It belonged to my grandmother before that." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not recognition exactly. More like the feeling of someone finding a page from a book they believed had been destroyed years earlier. He nodded almost to himself. "And before your grandmother?" I hesitated. "She always told me it had belonged to our family for generations." She never said anything more. He lowered his gaze briefly, as though weighing memories against certainty. One fingertip rested lightly against the edge of the table while the ballroom continued buzzing around us, completely unaware that something invisible had just changed. When he finally looked back at me, there was no trace of amusement in his expression. Only quiet curiosity mixed with something I could not yet understand. Then, almost too softly to hear above the music, he asked, "Has anyone ever tried to buy it from you?" I blinked, unsure whether I had heard him correctly. "No, sir," I answered. "No one has ever asked to buy it." He held my gaze for another quiet moment before giving the smallest nod, almost as though my answer confirmed something only he understood. "Thank you," he said simply. "You may go." I excused myself and wheeled the serving cart toward the kitchen entrance, but the strange conversation refused to leave my mind. Guests usually noticed expensive jewelry, not an old silver ring with faded edges and a sapphire no larger than a pencil eraser. Yet the only person in the ballroom who had not laughed at it seemed unable to look away. As the kitchen doors closed behind me, the familiar sounds of clattering dishes and rushing cooks replaced the soft music outside. Steam rose from industrial sinks while chefs called orders across the room. It was comforting chaos, predictable and ordinary. I preferred this world. Grace, one of the pastry chefs whispered while arranging miniature cheesecakes. What happened out there? Everyone is talking about table 1. I forced a smile. Nothing important. Nothing important does not make Mr. Lawson stop talking in the middle of a sentence. Before I could respond, our supervisor appeared carrying a clipboard. Grace, you are assigned exclusively to the private ballroom for the rest of the evening. Mr. Moretti requested uninterrupted service. My eyebrows lifted. Requested me? That is what I said. She sounded just as surprised as I felt. Be professional. I nodded, although my heartbeat had become noticeably faster. During 3 years at the Hawthorne Grand, no guest had ever requested me specifically. Most never remembered my face. I collected another tray and returned to the ballroom, where the evening had settled into comfortable elegance. A jazz quartet had replaced the string ensemble, conversations flowed easily, and waiters moved between tables carrying polished silver domes that reflected dozens of tiny lights overhead. I quietly refilled glasses and cleared empty plates, careful not to draw attention to myself. Still, every few minutes I sensed someone watching. Whenever I glanced toward the private table, Adrian Moretti was already looking somewhere else, speaking with investors, greeting community leaders, listening far more than he spoke. There was nothing dramatic about him, nothing that demanded attention through volume or theatrics. Yet somehow every conversation in the room seemed to orbit around him. Nearly an hour passed before I found myself near the entrance hallway arranging fresh flowers on a marble console table. I barely noticed one of the older businessmen approaching until he stopped beside me. Young lady, he said with a pleasant smile that did not quite reach his eyes, I would like another look at your ring. I instinctively folded my hands together. I am sorry, sir? Humor an old collector. His tone remained friendly. I have spent 40 years studying antique jewelry. That piece seems unusual. It is only sentimental, I replied gently. My grandmother wore it every day. Then surely she would not mind if you sold it for a generous price. I laughed softly, assuming he was joking. He was not. $10,000, he offered quietly. My smile disappeared. That amount was more money than I earned in several months. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but it is not for sale. He studied my face with growing interest instead of disappointment. You refused rather quickly. Some things cannot be replaced. His eyes drifted toward the ballroom where Adrian Moretti stood speaking with hotel executives. The older man became unusually thoughtful before adjusting his cufflinks. No, he murmured almost to himself. Some things certainly cannot. Then he walked away without another word, leaving me standing beside the flowers with a strange feeling settling deep inside my chest. For the first time in my life, I wondered if the ring I had worn almost every day carried a story that no one in my family had ever lived long enough to tell. I spent the next hour trying to convince myself that I had imagined the entire conversation. Wealthy people collected strange things all the time. Paintings. Rare watches. Vintage cars. Perhaps antique rings were simply another hobby I knew nothing about. That explanation should have settled my thoughts, but it did not explain the look in Adrian Moretti's eyes. It was never the look of a collector. It was the look of someone searching for a memory that refused to stay buried. I finished arranging the dessert display near the ballroom entrance when my supervisor hurried toward me again, her heels clicking sharply across the marble floor. Grace, she whispered, lowering her voice despite the music surrounding us. Mr. Moretti has asked if you would bring coffee to the private lounge upstairs after the gala concludes. I stared at her. Me? You are the only employee he requested. My stomach tightened. Did I do something wrong? She frowned. If you did, I doubt the owner of this hotel would be smiling the way he is right now. Before I could ask another question, she disappeared to greet a group of late-arriving donors. I remained standing beside the dessert table, unable to focus on the silver trays in front of me. Why would someone like Adrian Moretti want to speak with a hotel maid after the event? The question followed me through every task that remained. Refill coffee. Collect empty glasses. Replace folded napkins. Smile politely. Every movement happened automatically while my thoughts circled the same mystery. By 10 o'clock the charity auction had ended, and guests slowly gathered near the ballroom exits beneath towering arrangements of white orchids. Laughter echoed through the hallways as photographers captured farewell pictures and valets prepared luxury cars outside beneath the glowing hotel canopy. I was carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes toward the service corridor when a familiar voice stopped me. Miss Bennet. I turned to find the older collector from earlier approaching with another gentleman dressed in an immaculate navy suit. Both smiled politely, though something about their expressions felt unusually serious now. Yes, sir? The collector glanced briefly at the ring before looking back into my eyes. Forgive my persistence. Would you answer one more question? I shifted the tray carefully against my hip. If I can. Did your grandmother ever mention the name Eleanor? The tray suddenly felt heavier. My grandmother rarely spoke about her childhood, but one name had appeared more than once in old family letters stored inside a cedar chest beneath her bed. Eleanor. I had always assumed she was a distant relative. Why are you asking? I replied instead of answering directly. The two men exchanged a quick glance. Before either of them could speak, another voice entered the conversation from behind them. Calm. Steady. Impossible to mistake. Because they are asking questions that should have been directed to me first. The men immediately stepped aside. Adrian Moretti stood only a few feet away, one hand resting casually inside his jacket pocket while the other held a porcelain espresso cup. There was no anger in his face, only quiet authority that seemed to change the very air around us. The collector lowered his head respectfully. My apologies. Adrian nodded once. Accepted. Then he turned his full attention toward me. Miss Bennet, he said gently, I believe tonight has already become confusing enough. I managed a nervous smile. That is one way to describe it. To my surprise, the corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. It was the first hint of a smile I had seen all evening. Then allow me to make one promise before we speak upstairs. His eyes settled once more on the faded sapphire resting against my hand. Whatever you believe that ring is worth, I am beginning to think it is far more valuable than either of us imagined. I followed Adrian Moretti through a quiet corridor lined with oil paintings and polished walnut walls, carrying a silver coffee service that suddenly felt far heavier than porcelain and stainless steel should have. The noise from the ballroom faded behind us until all I could hear was the gentle rhythm of our footsteps against thick carpet. He walked without hurry, acknowledging hotel staff with brief nods that were returned with unmistakable respect. No one stopped him. No one questioned where he was going. Whatever influence he possessed had long since become part of the building itself. The private lounge overlooked Midtown through enormous windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. Yellow city lights reflected across the glass like scattered stars while distant traffic drifted upward in a constant hum. I carefully placed the coffee service on a small mahogany table and began pouring 2 cups, grateful for something familiar to occupy my hands. Cream or sugar, sir? I asked. Black, he answered. And for you? I looked up, surprised. I am working. You are also exhausted. His tone remained gentle. Please. Unsure how to respond, I poured myself a small cup before sitting only after he gestured toward the chair across from him. It felt strange sharing coffee with a guest whose presence alone had changed the atmosphere of an entire charity gala. For several quiet seconds neither of us spoke. He simply studied the city beyond the windows while lightly turning his untouched cup between his hands. Finally he broke the silence. You have been wearing that ring for 8 years. It was not a question. Yes. And no one in your family ever explained where it came from. I slowly shook my head. My grandmother always said some stories arrive only when people are ready to hear them. I thought she meant I was too young. Adrian smiled faintly. Perhaps she meant she was protecting you. A cool breeze whispered softly against the glass outside. I wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup, searching his expression for answers that still refused to appear. Earlier tonight someone offered to buy it, I said. $10,000. He nodded without surprise. He would have paid much more. I stared at him. For this? I lifted my hand, studying the worn silver band under the soft lamplight. Tiny scratches crossed the surface, and one side of the sapphire had been chipped years before when my grandmother dropped it on a stone porch. It looked ordinary. Beautiful to me, but ordinary. I do not understand. Adrian leaned forward slightly. Neither do I. Not completely. His honesty caught me off guard. Powerful people always seem to have immediate answers. He did not pretend to possess one. Then why is everyone suddenly interested? I asked quietly. He rested his elbows lightly on the chair and looked directly into my eyes. Because there are objects that become valuable for their materials, and there are objects that become priceless because they witness promises. The words settled over the room like falling snow. A promise? I repeated. He nodded once. Many years ago someone I trusted spoke about a silver ring with a blue stone. She described it in remarkable detail and said that if I ever saw it again, I should never judge the person wearing it by their clothes or their circumstances. My heartbeat quickened. Who was she? Adrian looked down into his untouched coffee before answering. That, he said softly, is exactly what I intend to discover. At that very moment a discreet knock sounded at the lounge door. Adrian glanced toward it without visible concern. Come in. The hotel manager stepped inside holding a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Mr. Moretti, he said respectfully, this arrived by courier less than 5 minutes ago. The messenger insisted it be delivered directly to you tonight. Adrian accepted the envelope, studying the unfamiliar seal for only a second before his calm expression changed almost imperceptibly. He looked from the envelope to the ring on my hand, then back again, as though two separate pieces of a forgotten puzzle had suddenly begun fitting together. Adrian did not break the wax seal immediately. Instead, he turned the envelope over once in his hands, studying every detail with the kind of patience that suggested he had learned long ago that haste often buried the truth. I watched quietly from across the room, unsure whether I should excuse myself or remain seated. Before I could decide, he looked up. Please stay, Miss Bennet. There was nothing demanding in his voice. It sounded more like a sincere request than an instruction. I settled back into the chair, wrapping both hands around the coffee cup that had already begun to cool. The city lights outside shimmered against the glass as silence filled the lounge once again. Finally Adrian slid a letter opener beneath the dark blue wax and unfolded a single sheet of cream-colored paper. His eyes moved across the page once. Then a second time, slower. I noticed the smallest change in his expression. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. He folded the letter carefully before placing it beside his untouched coffee. Is everything all right? I asked. He hesitated, as though deciding how much to reveal. That depends on how one defines all right. I offered an uncertain smile. That sounds complicated. It usually is when the past decides it has waited long enough. He reached into the envelope once more and removed a faded photograph no larger than a postcard. Time had softened the colors until everything carried a warm golden tint. He looked at it for several quiet seconds before turning it toward me across the table. Have you ever seen this woman? I accepted the photograph carefully. A young woman stood outside what looked like a small countryside church, smiling into the camera while sunlight rested across her face. She wore a simple blue dress, and although the picture had clearly been taken decades earlier, something about her seemed strangely familiar. Then my eyes found her left hand. The same silver ring. The same worn sapphire. My breath caught. She is wearing it. Adrian nodded. Yes. I studied the woman's face again, searching my memory. The gentle smile. The shape of her eyes. The slight wave in her light brown hair. My heart began beating faster. She looks like my grandmother when she was young. The words escaped almost as a whisper. Adrian remained completely still. I thought you might say that. I looked up from the photograph. Who was she to you? Instead of answering immediately, he walked toward the window overlooking Manhattan. His reflection blended with thousands of city lights beyond the glass. When I was 12 years old, he said quietly, my father believed that strength meant never accepting help from strangers. Life eventually proved him wrong. His voice carried no bitterness, only the calm honesty of someone revisiting an old memory. One afternoon, a woman wearing that ring made a decision that changed the direction of my family's future. She never asked for recognition. She never returned for a reward. She simply disappeared. I lowered my eyes back to the photograph. My grandmother had always avoided speaking about the years before my mother was born. Whenever I asked, she would smile gently and change the subject. I had assumed those memories were simply painful. Now I wondered whether they had been important instead. Adrian slowly returned to the table. The letter arrived from a private historical archive that has been searching through old estate records on my behalf for several months. He rested one finger lightly on the folded paper. Until tonight I believed they were chasing little more than a family legend. He met my eyes with quiet certainty. Now I believe they may have found the first real piece of evidence. I looked from the photograph to the ring resting on my hand, suddenly aware that something I had worn every day without a second thought was connecting two lives separated by decades. Whatever story my grandmother had taken with her, it was no longer staying buried, and somehow both of us had just become part of the next chapter. I barely noticed the coffee growing cold between my hands. The photograph rested on the table beside me, yet my eyes kept drifting back to it as though staring long enough might unlock memories that were never mine. My grandmother had always been the quiet center of our family. She baked cinnamon bread every Sunday, watered the roses outside her tiny white house, and smiled whenever life became difficult, but whenever I asked about her younger years, she would gently squeeze my hand and say that some chapters deserved to remain peaceful. I had believed she meant painful memories. Now I wondered if she had been protecting something much larger. Adrian remained standing near the window, his attention fixed on the skyline while the folded letter rested inside his jacket pocket. The silence between us felt different now. It was no longer uncomfortable. It was the silence of two strangers slowly realizing that their lives might have crossed long before either of them was born. May I ask you something? I finally said. He turned immediately. Anything. If my grandmother really knew your family, why would she never tell anyone? Adrian considered the question carefully before answering. Because gratitude is easiest to carry quietly. Some people help others because they expect recognition. Others help because they believe it is simply the right thing to do. I looked down at the sapphire catching the warm light above us. That sounded exactly like her. She never reminded anyone of the meals she delivered to sick neighbors or the coats she quietly bought for children whose parents could not afford winter clothes. She believed kindness became smaller the moment people applauded it. There is something else, Adrian continued. The archive included one additional detail. My eyes lifted. What detail? He reached into his jacket and unfolded the letter once more. According to the records, the woman wearing that ring refused a substantial financial gift after helping my family. Instead, she accepted only one promise. A promise? He nodded. If anyone carrying her family name ever needed help in the future, my family would answer without hesitation. A nervous laugh escaped before I could stop it. That sounds like something from an old movie. To my surprise, Adrian smiled more openly than before. Many family traditions do. The warmth in his expression disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared. The problem is that I have no proof beyond this letter and the photograph. Promises deserve certainty. I slowly traced one fingertip around the edge of my coffee cup. What happens now? Before Adrian could answer, his phone vibrated once against the wooden table. He glanced at the screen but did not immediately respond. Instead, he silenced the call and looked back at me. Now I verify every detail. Tonight? Tonight. I shook my head with a small smile. You really do not like waiting, do you? Waiting has a habit of allowing important things to disappear. His words lingered in the room. I understood exactly what he meant. My grandmother had been gone for almost 3 years. Every unanswered question had disappeared with her. Every forgotten story had become impossible to ask about. I suddenly wished I had spent less time talking about school and work and more time listening to the quiet moments she had almost shared. Adrian walked toward a built-in bookshelf along the far wall where several framed photographs from past charity events decorated the shelves. His attention paused on one black and white picture taken decades earlier inside the very same hotel. History leaves echoes, he said softly. Most people simply stop listening before they hear them. I followed his gaze, and for the first time that evening, I realized the ballroom downstairs, the old photograph, the mysterious letter, and the ring on my hand no longer felt like separate pieces of coincidence. They felt connected by something invisible that had been waiting years for someone to notice. Neither of us realized that while we sat quietly searching through forgotten history, someone else inside the hotel had already begun asking questions about the maid wearing an old silver ring, and unlike Adrian, their interest had nothing to do with honoring a promise. I expected the evening to end quietly after leaving the private lounge, but the moment the elevator doors opened onto the main floor, I realized something had changed. Conversations that had once drifted naturally through the marble lobby now paused for the briefest second whenever I walked past. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore. A few guests looked at me, then at the ring, then whispered to one another before pretending nothing had happened. Somehow the quiet conversation upstairs had already become the newest mystery inside the Hawthorne Grand. I returned to the housekeeping station to collect my coat, hoping to slip out without drawing any more attention. My shift had officially ended nearly 30 minutes earlier, and all I wanted was the familiar comfort of my tiny apartment, a bowl of tomato soup, and a long night's sleep. Instead, my supervisor met me outside the staff room with an expression I could not immediately read. "Grace," she said carefully, "before you leave, could you help with one last request?" I smiled politely despite my exhaustion. Of course. Several guests remain in the Orchid Lounge. They asked for fresh coffee service. I accepted the silver tray without another question. Work had always been simple. It asked only for effort, not understanding. As I approached the Orchid Lounge, I immediately recognized the voices. The same group who had laughed at my ring earlier in the evening sat comfortably around a polished walnut table, finishing dessert while discussing investment portfolios and vacation homes. One of the women looked up as I entered. Recognition flashed across her face, followed by the familiar amused smile. "Well," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "our famous waitress has returned." I placed the coffee pot on the table as calmly as I could. "Would anyone like a refill?" "Only if the ring comes with it," another guest joked. Polite laughter circled the room again. I focused on pouring coffee into delicate porcelain cups without spilling a single drop. "Tell me," the first woman continued, resting her chin lightly on one hand, "did someone finally explain why that little antique has become so interesting?" I met her eyes with the same calm expression my grandmother had always carried whenever someone mistook kindness for weakness. "No, ma'am." "Then perhaps there is nothing special about it after all." Another man leaned back in his chair. "People enjoy creating legends where none exist." I nodded gently. "Perhaps." My answer seemed to disappoint them. They had expected embarrassment, maybe even an argument. Instead, I simply continued serving coffee exactly as I had served every other table that evening. My grandmother used to say that silence often revealed more about other people than words ever could. As I reached for the final cup, one guest chuckled and shook his head. If someone offered me $10,000 for an old ring, I would have sold it before they finished the sentence. I smiled politely. Everyone values different things, sir. He laughed again. Spoken like someone who has never seen real money. Before I could respond, another voice answered from the doorway behind me. Or perhaps spoken like someone who understands that not everything important can be purchased. The room fell completely silent. I did not need to turn around to recognize Adrian's voice. Every guest at the table straightened almost instinctively. He entered without hurry, his charcoal suit unchanged, his expression composed, yet the atmosphere shifted the moment he stepped inside. He looked first at the guests, then at me, and finally at the coffee cup resting beside the woman who had started the conversation. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said calmly. No one answered. The confidence that had filled the room only seconds earlier seemed to disappear beneath the quiet certainty in his voice. Adrian walked toward the table and stopped beside my serving tray. Without taking his eyes off the guests, he reached for the coffee pot and poured a cup himself before placing it gently back onto the silver tray. Then, almost casually, he spoke the sentence that made every person in the room forget the laughter they had shared only moments before. "I believe all of you owe Miss Bennet an apology before this evening comes to an end." I stood perfectly still with both hands resting on the silver tray, almost forgetting to breathe. No one in the Orchid Lounge moved. The confident smiles that had filled the room only moments earlier slowly disappeared as Adrian Moretti's quiet words settled over the table. It amazed me that he had not raised his voice, threatened anyone, or even changed his expression, yet somehow the entire atmosphere had shifted. The woman who had mocked me first cleared her throat and forced a polite smile. "Mr. Moretti, surely this is only a misunderstanding." Adrian looked at her calmly. "Then misunderstandings should be the easiest things to correct." She glanced around the table, searching for support that never came. The older collector I had spoken with earlier lowered his eyes toward his coffee, saying nothing. One by one, the others seemed to realize that whatever relationship Adrian had to the ring, it mattered far more than they had assumed. Finally, the businessman who had joked about selling it for $10,000 leaned forward with an uneasy laugh. "If our comments sounded insensitive, I apologize." Adrian did not immediately answer. Instead, he turned toward me. "Miss Bennet." "Yes, sir?" "Did those remarks make your evening more pleasant?" I blinked, surprised by the question. "No, sir." "Did they make your work easier?" "No." "Did you deserve to be treated as entertainment while doing your job?" The room remained silent as every eye shifted toward me. I hesitated before answering honestly. "I do not think anyone deserves that." Adrian nodded once. "Neither do I." He returned his attention to the guests. "Then perhaps the apology should be offered to the person who actually received the remarks." Another long silence followed. It stretched just long enough for discomfort to replace pride. The woman slowly stood from her chair and faced me directly. "Miss Bennet," she said quietly, "I spoke without kindness. I am sorry." Her words sounded sincere, perhaps because they had become unavoidable. The others followed one after another. Each apology differed slightly, but every one of them acknowledged the same mistake. I accepted each with a gentle smile. "Thank you." Nothing more. My grandmother had often said that forgiveness became lighter when it expected nothing in return. Adrian watched the exchange without satisfaction or triumph. He seemed interested only in restoring something invisible that should never have been taken away in the first place. Once everyone had finished speaking, he picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip before placing it back onto its saucer. "I appreciate your willingness to correct the situation," he said. "Kindness rarely costs as much as regret." No one argued. As the gathering quietly dissolved, guests excused themselves with polite nods and collected their coats. Within minutes the Orchid Lounge had become almost empty. I remained beside the serving cart, still trying to understand why a man whose influence reached across the city had chosen to defend someone he had met only hours earlier. Adrian waited until the last guest disappeared into the hallway before walking toward the fireplace overlooking the lounge. I followed instinctively, carrying the tray back toward the service station. "You did not have to do that," I said softly. He looked into the fading firelight before answering. "Yes, I did." "Why?" He smiled faintly. "Because I have spent enough years watching people mistake wealth for worth." I lowered my eyes. "I have become used to it. That concerns me more than it comforts me." His answer caught me completely off guard. Before I could think of a response, his phone vibrated again. This time he answered immediately. He listened for less than 30 seconds without saying a word, then thanked the caller and ended the conversation. When he looked back at me, there was a quiet certainty in his expression that had not been there before. "Miss Bennett," he said gently, "my research team has just confirmed something that changes everything we believed about your grandmother, and I think tomorrow morning is going to answer questions neither of us expected to ask." I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandmother's smile beside the faded photograph, heard Adrian's calm voice repeating the same sentence over and over. "Tomorrow morning is going to answer questions neither of us expected to ask." By 7 o'clock I was already standing outside the Hawthorne Grand in my freshly pressed uniform, coffee warming my hands against the cool Manhattan air. The city was only beginning to wake. Delivery trucks rolled quietly along the avenue, commuters hurried towards subway entrances, and the golden morning sun reflected across rows of glass skyscrapers. Everything looked ordinary, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. As I stepped through the employee entrance, my supervisor hurried toward me carrying a small envelope with my name written neatly across the front. "Grace," she said with obvious curiosity, "this was delivered before sunrise." I accepted it carefully. Inside was a single cream-colored card. "Miss Bennett. If you are willing, please join me in the Heritage Conference Room at 8 o'clock. There are several documents I believe belong to your family. Adrian Moretti." I checked the clock above the reception desk. 7:43. My heartbeat quickened. 15 minutes later I stood outside the conference room, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my sleeves before gently knocking. "Come in," Adrian's voice answered. The room looked more like a private library than a meeting space. Old books lined dark wooden shelves, morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, and several archival boxes rested neatly across the polished conference table. Adrian stood beside them wearing a navy suit instead of the charcoal one from the previous evening. He greeted me with the same calm expression that somehow made every room feel quieter. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I was not sure I would be able to concentrate on work today anyway," I admitted with a nervous smile. "Neither was I." He gestured toward the table. "Please sit." I noticed several carefully preserved photographs, handwritten letters, and what appeared to be copies of official records arranged in perfect order. None of them looked expensive. None of them looked extraordinary. Yet Adrian handled every page with remarkable care. "My researchers worked through the night," he explained. "The Historical Archive opened several collections that had remained sealed for decades because they finally had enough information to identify the woman in your photograph." He slid one document gently toward me. At the top appeared a familiar name. Eleanor Bennett. My breath caught. That was my grandmother. Adrian nodded. "Yes." I continued reading. Volunteer nurse. Community relief coordinator. Recipient of multiple civic commendations that had never been publicly announced because she declined every ceremony. The words blurred slightly as unexpected tears filled my eyes. I had known my grandmother as the woman who baked bread and planted roses. I had never known she had quietly spent years helping complete strangers. Adrian waited patiently until I finished reading. Then he opened another folder containing a newspaper clipping preserved inside clear archival plastic. The faded headline read, "Local woman declines public recognition after assisting prominent family during financial crisis." There was no photograph, only a short article describing how an anonymous volunteer had refused both publicity and a substantial reward. That family, Adrian said quietly, was mine. I looked at him in disbelief. Your family knew her all along? He slowly shook his head. We knew her first name. We knew about the ring. We knew she disappeared before anyone could properly thank her. But we never discovered where life had taken her afterward. He placed one final document onto the table. It was a handwritten letter signed by his grandfather. Across the bottom, beneath elegant handwriting faded by time, one sentence had been carefully underlined. To the woman who refused our fortune, we leave something far greater. Our family's promise. If we ever find yours again, they will never stand alone. I stared at the words in complete silence, finally understanding why Adrian had looked at my ring with recognition instead of curiosity. The ring had never been valuable because of silver or sapphire. It had become priceless because it carried a promise that one family had spent decades hoping they would someday have the chance to keep. I sat quietly, reading my great-grandfather's promise again and again until the ink seemed less like words on aging paper and more like a voice carried across generations. My grandmother had never wanted recognition. She had accepted neither money nor public praise. She had simply walked away with the same quiet dignity that had shaped every lesson she ever taught me. Suddenly every small memory became clearer. Every time she reminded me that kindness was never a transaction. Every time she insisted that people revealed themselves by how they treated those who could offer them nothing. She had not been repeating comforting sayings. She had been living by a promise she chose to protect for the rest of her life. Adrian carefully returned the fragile documents to their archival folders before looking at me with thoughtful sincerity. There is something I have wanted to say since last night. I met his eyes. What is it? He folded his hands together on the polished table. My family spent decades believing we had failed to keep our word. We searched whenever another clue appeared, but every trail eventually disappeared. Last night, when I saw your ring, I thought hope was making me imagine connections that were not really there. I smiled faintly. Instead, it found me while I was serving coffee. A quiet laugh escaped both of us, breaking the weight of the morning for the first time. It lasted only a moment, but it felt surprisingly natural. Adrian's expression soon returned to thoughtful calm. There is another matter. He reached toward a leather folder resting beside him but did not open it immediately. My attorneys prepared several options after reviewing your family's records. I gently raised one hand before he could continue. If this is about money, please do not. He paused without appearing offended. May I ask why? I looked down at the silver ring on my finger. Because if my grandmother refused a fortune, I do not think she expected me to accept one simply because time passed. Adrian remained silent for several long seconds. Then he slowly closed the folder without ever opening it. That, he said softly, is exactly the answer I hoped you would give. I tilted my head with quiet curiosity. You hoped? He nodded. Promises lose their meaning when they become business transactions. His words settled gently between us. Then what did your grandfather mean by saying his family would never let ours stand alone? Adrian stood and walked toward the window overlooking the busy streets below. Morning traffic moved steadily through Manhattan while pedestrians hurried toward offices, carrying briefcases and coffee cups without realizing that lives were quietly changing several stories above them. He meant responsibility, Adrian answered. Not ownership. Not control. Responsibility. I joined him beside the window. The city stretched endlessly into the distance. Responsibility can take many forms. It can. He looked at me with the same calm certainty that had first caught my attention in the ballroom. Sometimes it means opening a door for someone. Sometimes it means protecting a family name. Sometimes it simply means making certain a good person never has to face unnecessary hardship alone. Before I could respond, a gentle knock sounded at the conference room door. The hotel owner entered carrying a tablet, smiling warmly the moment he saw us. Mr. Moretti, Miss Bennet, I hope I am not interrupting. Adrian shook his head. Not at all. The owner turned toward me. Grace, I wanted to personally apologize for the way some of our guests treated you last night. Their behavior did not reflect the standards of this hotel. Thank you, I replied sincerely. He smiled before continuing. There is something else. Several members of our board have heard about your professionalism during yesterday's event. They would like to meet with you this afternoon regarding an opportunity that was not available before yesterday. I blinked in surprise. An opportunity? The owner nodded. One that has absolutely nothing to do with charity, sympathy, or favors. It has everything to do with the character you demonstrated when everyone else was watching the ring instead of the person wearing it. The hotel owner's words stayed with me long after he left the conference room. Character. It was such a simple word, yet it carried more weight than any title I had ever held. For years I believed success belonged to people born into the right families, wearing the right clothes, and sitting at the right tables. My grandmother had quietly believed something entirely different. She believed character eventually found its own seat. Adrian waited until the door closed before speaking again. Your grandmother would be proud of the way you handled yesterday. I smiled softly. I wish she could have told me all of this herself. He nodded with understanding. Sometimes people protect the truth because they want the next generation to build confidence without depending on old stories. I looked once more at the folders resting across the table. She wanted me to earn my own life first. I believe she did. Later that afternoon I entered the executive boardroom feeling even more nervous than I had during the charity gala. 12 people sat around a long walnut table overlooking the city. Some faces were familiar. A few had attended the event the night before. Others I recognized only from framed photographs displayed throughout the hotel. My supervisor quietly smiled as I entered, silently encouraging me to relax. The hotel owner welcomed me warmly before inviting me to sit. Miss Bennett, he began, we reviewed several reports this morning. Guests consistently describe you with the same words. Professional. Patient. Respectful. Calm under pressure. I listened without interrupting. Last night simply allowed more people to notice qualities that have apparently existed for years. One board member leaned forward with a pleasant smile. Your supervisors tell us you often stay late to help coworkers without being asked. Another added, you have also completed every hospitality training course the hotel offered on your own time. I almost laughed from embarrassment. Those things had never seemed remarkable. They were simply how I had been raised. The owner folded his hands together. We would like to offer you a position in our guest relations leadership development program. I stared at him, convinced I had misunderstood. Leadership? He nodded. It is a competitive program that prepares future department managers. You were recommended because of your work ethic long before yesterday's gala. Last night's events simply confirmed what our management team already believed. I felt tears gathering again, though for a completely different reason than before. I do not know what to say. You can begin with yes if you are interested, another executive replied with a warm smile that filled the room with gentle laughter. I accepted the opportunity with sincere gratitude, understanding that it had been earned through years of ordinary mornings, careful work, and quiet persistence rather than one extraordinary evening. As the meeting concluded, Adrian waited outside the boardroom near a large window overlooking the hotel entrance. Afternoon sunlight reflected across the polished marble floor as guests came and went beneath revolving glass doors. Congratulations, he said as I approached. Thank you. I shook my head with an amazed smile. Everything feels unreal. Real change usually does. We stood together watching the city move beyond the windows. After a thoughtful silence, Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small velvet box. He placed it gently in my hands without saying a word. Confused, I slowly opened it. Inside rested a delicate silver chain with a tiny sapphire pendant crafted to match the stone in my grandmother's ring. It was elegant without being extravagant. Timeless rather than expensive. I looked up in surprise. What is this? Adrian smiled gently. My grandfather commissioned it many years after the woman wearing your ring disappeared. He hoped that if her family was ever found, there would be a way to honor her kindness without asking for the ring she treasured. My throat tightened as I carefully lifted the pendant into the afternoon light. On the back, engraved in tiny letters almost too small to see, was a single sentence that somehow captured everything my grandmother had lived for. Kindness remembered is never kindness forgotten. Several months passed before I fully understood that my life had changed long before anyone offered me a promotion or uncovered my grandmother's forgotten history. The real change had happened the moment I chose not to remove a ring simply because strangers laughed at it. Looking back, that decision seemed so small. At the time, it felt like nothing more than holding on to the last gift my grandmother had ever placed in my hand. Yet sometimes the quietest choices echo farther than the loudest victories. The leadership program challenged me every single day. I learned how to welcome international guests, resolve difficult situations with patience, mentor new employees, and lead teams that had once included me as their newest member. Every lesson reminded me that titles could change overnight, but character took years to build. Adrian remained part of my life in a way neither of us had expected. Sometimes he visited the hotel for business meetings, and we shared coffee whenever our schedules allowed. Other times he would send another historical document uncovered by his researchers, each one adding another small piece to the remarkable story my grandmother had never spoken about. Together we slowly reconstructed a past that had almost disappeared forever. One autumn afternoon he invited me to a small community center on the edge of the city. It was an ordinary brick building surrounded by maple trees glowing with red and gold leaves. Children laughed on the playground while volunteers carried boxes of donated books through the front entrance. Adrian stood beside a newly installed bronze plaque covered by a simple white cloth. There were no television cameras. No reporters. Only a handful of neighborhood families, several elderly volunteers who had known my grandmother decades earlier, and the hotel owner quietly standing near the back. Adrian looked at me before gently removing the cloth. The plaque bore a single name. Eleanor Bennett. Beneath it were words that brought tears to my eyes before I had finished reading. In honor of a woman who believed that kindness required no audience and whose quiet courage inspired generations she would never meet. I covered my mouth with one hand as emotion overwhelmed me. My grandmother had spent her entire life avoiding recognition, yet somehow this tribute felt exactly right because it was not celebrating wealth, power, or status. It celebrated the values she had quietly planted in everyone around her. Adrian stepped beside me without speaking. After a long moment he said softly, "My grandfather always believed promises should outlive the people who make them." I looked down at the silver ring resting on my hand and then at the sapphire pendant hanging beside it. For the first time I understood that neither belonged to the past anymore. They belonged to the future. They would remind every generation after mine that compassion could travel farther than ambition and that dignity never depended on the opinions of strangers. As the afternoon sun settled across the autumn leaves, children ran laughing through the courtyard without knowing why the adults around them seemed so emotional. Perhaps that was the greatest ending anyone could hope for. A promise kept so completely that the next generation could simply enjoy the peace it created. Sometimes people spend their entire lives searching for treasure without realizing they have been measuring the wrong things. They count diamonds, fortunes, and titles while overlooking loyalty, integrity, and quiet courage. The guests who laughed that evening saw only worn silver and a faded blue stone. Adrian saw a promise. My grandmother saw responsibility. And I finally saw the lesson they had both been protecting all along. The world will always notice what shines first, but the things that truly change lives are almost never the ones that glitter. They are the promises we keep when no one is watching, the kindness we offer without expecting applause, and the quiet strength to honor what matters even when everyone else believes it is worthless.